It was past midnight and the street was silent. The kind of silence that makes even the smallest sound echo in your ears. Two men walked slowly down the sidewalk, dressed in dark clothes. They looked around carefully, making sure no one was watching. Their steps were quiet, but their hearts beat fast. The old house at the end of the street was their target that night. The house looked peaceful from the outside. It was small, with a porch light that flickered now and then. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it belonged to an old man who lived alone. People said he was quiet and kept to himself. Some even whispered that he used to be in the army, and that he had a lot of money saved from his time serving. The two men had heard the same story, and that was enough to bring them there. They stopped at the edge of the yard. One of them pulled out a small flashlight, keeping the light low to the ground. The other man checked the back gate. It wasn't locked. They exchanged a quick nod and slipped through. Everything seemed easy so far. Too easy. Inside the house, the old man was awake. He had been sitting in his armchair, reading a worn-out book when he heard the faint creak of the gate outside. He didn't move right away. Instead, he put his book down and listened. Years of habit had trained him to pay attention to small things. A sound, a shadow, a shift in the air. He turned off the lamp beside him and the room went dark. He sat still for a few seconds, letting his eyes adjust. Then he stood up quietly and walked toward the hallway. The men outside were moving slowly. They tried to open a window, but it was locked. One of them pulled out a small metal tool and started working on it. The other kept watch, glancing around nervously. The night felt too still, and every time the wind moved through the trees, he jumped a little. Finally, the lock clicked. The window opened just enough for them to slip inside. The moment their shoes touched the wooden floor, the older man in the house knew exactly where they were. He didn't rush. He took a deep breath, remembering the training that had once kept him alive in far worse situations. He moved quietly toward the back of the house and reached for the small metal bar he kept by the door, not to attack, but to keep it closed. He slid the lock into place, blocking one exit. The two men, still unaware, crept through the kitchen. The house smelled faintly of old books and coffee. On the table, a half-finished puzzle lay untouched. One of them whispered, "Let's check the living room." The other nodded, shining the flashlight ahead. The beam of light landed on an old photo frame. Inside it, a younger version of the old man stood proudly in a uniform, medals pinned to his chest. He was really in the army. One of them whispered. The other laughed quietly, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Yeah, well, he's probably sleeping. Old people don't hear much anyway. But the old man heard everything. He could tell from the way they spoke that they were nervous. He could hear the tremble in their voices. He remembered that feeling, fear mixed with adrenaline, and he almost pitied them. Almost. He moved to the living room, taking a different route through the hallway so he wouldn't be seen. He reached for the light switch near the door and waited. The sound of footsteps came closer. Then he flipped the switch. A bright light filled the room, blinding the two intruders. They froze, turning quickly to see who had done it. Standing near the door was the old man. His expression was calm, not angry or afraid. He looked at them the way a teacher might look at two students caught cheating on a test. "You picked the wrong house," he said in a firm voice. It wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to make both men stop moving. One of them tried to speak, but his voice cracked. The other raised his hand slightly. "Look, we don't want trouble, old man. Just stay out of the way and we'll be gone." The old man shook his head slowly. "That's not how it works. You break into someone's home, you deal with what comes next." The two men exchanged a glance. For a second, it looked like they were about to run, but then they realized something. The door behind them was locked. They turned to the window they had come through, but it was closed again. Somehow the old man had moved faster than they expected. "You think I didn't hear you?" the veteran asked quietly. He took a step forward, his shadow stretching across the floor. "You made enough noise to wake the whole street." One of them muttered under his breath, trying to find a way out. The old man reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He didn't dial right away. Instead, he held it up so they could see it. "You have one chance to leave this place peacefully," he said. "Or you can wait here for the police. Your choice." For a few seconds, no one moved. The tension in the room was thick. The old man didn't look like much of a threat, but there was something in his eyes, a calmness that came from knowing exactly what to do. The thieves could feel it. They realized he wasn't afraid of them at all. In fact, it felt like he was in control of everything. Finally, the one holding the flashlight lowered it. "We're leaving," he said, his voice shaky. "We didn't mean to hurt anyone." "Then go," the old man replied. He didn't step aside, but he nodded toward the door leading to the front yard. He had already unlocked it when he turned on the light. He didn't need to chase them. He just stood there, steady and silent. The two men hurried toward the door, tripping over themselves as they went. When they stepped outside, the cold air hit their faces and they ran as fast as they could down the street. Behind them, the house remained still. The old man watched through the window until they were gone. Then he locked the door again and sat back in his chair. He picked up his book, but for a while he didn't read. He just sat there thinking. He wasn't angry or proud. He was just tired. He had seen enough of fear in his lifetime to know what it looked like. Those boys had come in expecting an easy night, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Maybe now they would think twice before breaking into someone else's home. After a few minutes, he stood up and went to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water and looked out the window. The night had gone quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Somewhere far away, a dog barked. He took a slow sip and smiled to himself. Not because he had scared them off, but because he had stayed calm. That was something his years of service had taught him, to stay steady even when things went wrong. Before heading to bed, he checked the locks one more time. Everything was in place. The flashlight the men had dropped still lay on the floor. He picked it up and placed it on the table, planning to hand it over to the police in the morning. Then he turned off the lights and went upstairs. Outside, the street was empty again. The two men were long gone, still running, still afraid. For the first time that night, they realized how foolish their plan had been. They had thought the old man would be helpless, that he wouldn't fight back. But instead, he had faced them with nothing but calm and control. And that scared them more than anything else could. Back in the house, the old man finally lay down. He closed his eyes and soon the quiet returned. The kind of quiet that only comes after a storm passes. The kind that makes you feel deep down that you're safe again. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the windows of the small house. The old man woke early, just like he always did. He moved slowly but with purpose, making himself a cup of coffee before sitting down by the kitchen table. The events of the previous night replayed in his mind, but he didn't dwell on them. To him, it was just another test of patience. He had faced worse things in life and learned long ago not to let fear or anger control him. He looked out the window at the quiet street. Nothing seemed out of place. The neighborhood was waking up. Dogs barking, a few cars driving by, someone jogging on the sidewalk. Life was normal again. Still, he picked up the phone and called the local police station. His voice was calm when he told them what had happened. The officer on the other end sounded surprised, but said they'd send someone over to take a statement. A few minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. Two officers stepped out, one young and new to the job, the other older and more experienced. When they entered the house, the old man greeted them politely. He offered them coffee, which they politely declined, and then explained everything. How he had heard the noise, how he had stayed quiet, and how the intruders had fled once confronted. The younger officer listened with wide eyes, clearly impressed. "So you didn't use any weapon? You just stood there and scared them off?" The old man nodded, a faint smile on his face. "No need for violence. Sometimes calm is stronger than force." The older officer chuckled softly. "You must have seen your fair share of trouble in the service, sir." The veteran didn't answer right away. He looked at the medals hanging on the wall, then back at the officers. "Yes," he said quietly. "Enough to know that people often don't think about what they're doing until it's too late." After taking his statement, the officers promised to increase patrols in the area for the next few days. They collected the flashlight left behind by the intruders and assured him they'd look into any fingerprints. When they left, the old man felt a sense of peace return to the house. He spent the rest of the morning cleaning up, putting things back in order. Nothing had been stolen, and apart from the window latch that needed fixing, there was no real damage. As he worked, his mind wandered to the two men who had broken in. They had looked young, maybe in their 20s. Their hands shook and their voices were unsteady. They didn't seem like hardened criminals, just lost souls trying to find an easy way out of their troubles. Later that afternoon, a knock on the door broke his thoughts. It was his neighbor, an older woman who had lived down the street for years. She had heard about the break-in from the police. Her eyes were wide with worry. "Oh dear, are you all right? I can't believe someone would do that to you." He smiled gently. I'm fine. Nothing to worry about. They didn't get away with anything. She shook her head. You're lucky. Things like that don't usually end well. He didn't respond, just nodded and thanked her for checking in. After she left, he sat back down at the table, feeling grateful that it hadn't gone any worse. He had lived long enough to know that sometimes fate gives you a warning before something bigger happens. Maybe this was one of those times. A few days passed quietly. The police didn't find much, just a few footprints in the backyard and some partial prints on the flashlight. But something unexpected happened on the third morning. There was another knock at the door, this time softer. When the old man opened it, he saw a young man standing there, nervous and looking down at his shoes. It took him a second to recognize the face. It was one of the intruders. The young man's voice trembled. Sir, I wanted to say sorry. I didn't mean for things to go that way. We thought your house was empty. The old man stayed silent for a moment. His expression didn't change. You shouldn't be here, he said calmly. You know the police are still looking for you. I know, the young man said quickly. But I couldn't sleep. I keep seeing your face in my head. You didn't yell. You didn't fight. You just stood there like you already knew what we were going to do. I've never been so scared in my life, and I don't even understand why. The old man sighed. Because you realized what you were doing was wrong. Fear isn't always bad, it can wake people up. The young man looked ashamed. I've been out of work for months. My friends said we could make some quick money. I didn't think about the people we'd hurt. I just thought about getting out of debt. The old man studied him for a moment, seeing more than just guilt in his eyes. There was regret, too. He stepped aside. Come in, he said. The young man hesitated but entered slowly. The house looked the same as it did that night, except for the repaired window. He sat at the edge of a chair, keeping his head down. The old man poured him a cup of coffee and placed it in front of him. They sat in silence for a few minutes before the old man spoke again. You know, I've met men who did terrible things for worse reasons, but most of them didn't learn from it. You still have time to change that. The young man nodded, his eyes starting to water. I don't know how. Everything's been falling apart. Start small, the old man said. Own your mistake. Turn yourself in, then move forward. You can't undo what's done, but you can decide what comes next. The young man looked up, surprised. You'd really tell me to do that? Yes, hiding won't make you free. For a long while, neither spoke. The ticking clock filled the room. Finally, the young man stood up. I'll go to the police. I'll tell them what I did. The old man nodded. That's the right choice. Before leaving, the young man turned back. Thank you, he said softly. You didn't have to listen. Most people would have slammed the door in my face. I've lived long enough to know that everyone deserves one chance to do the right thing, the old man replied. After he left, the veteran sat quietly again. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't about justice or fear. It was about understanding. Maybe that was the real reason he had survived so much in his life. Not just to fight, but to help others see there was another way. That evening, the phone rang. It was the police again. They told him one of the suspects had turned himself in. The officer said the young man wanted to apologize and take responsibility. The old man thanked them and hung up. He didn't say anything more, just looked out the window at the sunset. The sky was painted in soft shades of gold and orange, and for the first time in a long while he felt peace. The next day, the police returned the flashlight. The young man had confirmed it was his. The officer said he'd mentioned meeting with the old man and that it had changed something in him. The veteran listened quietly, nodding. Sometimes, he said with a faint smile, the best way to win a fight is not to start one at all. That night, as he prepared for bed, he thought about how strange life could be. A few nights ago, fear had entered his home. But instead of breaking him, it had led to something better, something human. The world was still full of mistakes, but it was also full of chances to fix them. He turned off the light, lay down, and let the quiet of the house surround him again. Outside, the street was calm. No footsteps, no whispers, just peace. For the old man, that was enough. Days passed quietly after the young man turned himself in. The old veteran's life slowly returned to normal, though something inside him had changed. Each morning he followed the same routine: coffee, newspaper, and a short walk to the nearby park. Yet his thoughts often drifted back to that night and to the young man who had come to his door. trembling and full of regret. There was something about that moment that stayed with him. Maybe it was the honesty in the boy's eyes or the way he had faced the truth despite the fear. One afternoon, as the old man walked back home from the park, he saw a police car parked outside his house. His heart sank for a moment, wondering if something had gone wrong. When he reached the gate, the same officer who had visited before stepped out and greeted him politely. "Sir, sorry to bother you again," the officer said with a respectful nod. "We just wanted to let you know. The young man who turned himself in has been very cooperative. He gave us information about his partner, too. We're in the process of finding him." The old man nodded slowly. "I hope the other one does the right thing, too," he said quietly. The officer smiled faintly. "You made quite an impression on him. He told us you were calm, that you spoke to him like a father. Not everyone would have done that." The veteran gave a small shrug. "Sometimes people just need someone to listen. Most of the time, they already know what they did wrong." The officer thanked him again and left, leaving the old man standing in the doorway, thinking about those words. Like a father? He hadn't been called that in a long time. His own son had passed away years ago in an accident, and though time had dulled the pain, the emptiness had never completely gone away. Maybe that was why he had shown patience instead of anger that night, because somewhere deep down, he saw a little bit of his son in those two young men. That evening, as he sat on his porch, the air was calm and cool. The world felt slower somehow, quieter. He could hear the distant laughter of children playing down the street, the hum of crickets in the grass. For a man who had seen war and loss, moments like these meant everything. He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed, when he heard the faint sound of footsteps on the gravel path. He opened his eyes to see a familiar figure walking slowly toward him. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks. But as the figure came closer, he realized it was the other young man, the one who had escaped that night. The old man didn't move or speak right away. The young man stopped a few feet away, his face pale, his eyes tired. He didn't look dangerous. If anything, he looked lost. "I know you probably don't want to see me," the young man said quietly. "But I had to come." The old man studied him for a moment, then spoke calmly. "I suppose you heard your friend turned himself in?" The young man nodded. "Yeah, he told me what happened. He said you didn't yell or call the police right away. He said you looked at us like you weren't afraid." "I wasn't," the veteran said simply. "Fear doesn't help anyone. It only makes people do foolish things." The young man shifted his weight, his hands trembling slightly. He said talking to you changed him. "That's why I'm here. I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore. I've been hiding, jumping from place to place. I can't sleep. I keep thinking about that night. I can still hear your voice." The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood up slowly, his movements steady but deliberate. "You can't run forever," he said. "If you really want to make things right, you know what you have to do." The young man lowered his head. "Turn myself in?" "Yes, it's not easy, but it's the only way to start over." There was silence between them for a few seconds. The only sound was the gentle rustle of the leaves. Then the young man spoke again, his voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt anyone. We just wanted money. I didn't even think about what it would mean. I thought it would be simple." The old man sighed softly. "Nothing worth doing is ever simple. I learned that a long time ago." He motioned toward the porch. "Sit down. There's no use talking while standing." The young man hesitated but obeyed. The veteran went inside for a moment and returned with 2 cups of tea. They sat in silence at first, sipping slowly. The old man's calm presence made the younger one feel both uneasy and strangely at peace. "Can I ask you something?" The young man finally said. "Go ahead." "Why didn't you stop us that night? You could have called the police before we even got in." The old man gave a faint smile. "Because sometimes people need to see where the wrong road leads before they realize it's the wrong one. If I'd stopped you right away, maybe you'd have just gone to someone else's house next time. But that night you learned something. You saw what fear looks like when it doesn't control you. That stays with people." The young man stared at him, unsure how to respond. No one had ever spoken to him that way before. Not with anger, not with pity, but with understanding. They talked for nearly an hour. The young man told him about his family, his mistakes, and how he'd fallen into the wrong crowd. The old man listened quietly, occasionally nodding, occasionally offering a word or two of advice. When the sky began to darken, the veteran finally spoke again. Do you have anyone waiting for you? The young man shook his head. No one. My parents gave up on me a long time ago. Then maybe it's time you stop giving up on yourself, the old man said softly. Something in those words broke through the walls the young man had built around himself. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. He stood up slowly, his voice low but determined. I'll go tomorrow. I'll turn myself in. The old man nodded. Good. And remember, what matters most isn't what you've done, but what you do next. The young man extended his hand. The old man hesitated for a moment, then shook it firmly. There was no judgment in his grip, only quiet strength. When the young man left, the old man sat back down, watching him walk away until he disappeared into the fading light. He felt a strange sense of peace again, not because things were perfect, but because something good had come out of something bad. The next morning, a police car stopped by once again. The officer told him both men were now in custody. The second one had turned himself in early that morning. The old man listened quietly, nodding. The officer smiled and said, You might not realize it, but you changed those boys' lives. Most people would have been angry. You gave them a chance. The veteran looked away, his eyes distant. Everyone deserves a chance, he said softly. Someone once gave me one too. After the officer left, the old man walked into his living room and sat in front of the old photo frame on the mantel. It was the same picture the young men had seen that night. Him in uniform, standing tall, medals shining. But now he looked at it differently. He remembered the people who had helped him become the man he was, the commanders who believed in him, the friends who stood beside him, the strangers who showed him kindness when he needed it most. He realized then that life had come full circle. Once he had been the one needing guidance. Now he had become the one giving it. As the sun set that evening, the house felt warm and calm. The veteran sat by the window, watching the sky turn shades of gold and pink. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone. Somewhere out there, two young men were beginning a new chapter of their lives, learning the same lessons he had once learned, the power of owning up to mistakes and the strength that comes from starting again. And in that quiet moment, the old man smiled. Not because everything was perfect, but because sometimes peace doesn't come from what you gain. It comes from what you give. Weeks passed after both young men turned themselves in. The old veteran's house once again felt peaceful, but this time, the silence wasn't lonely. It was calm. Every morning he sat by the window with his cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the sky. The world outside moved on as usual, but inside, something had changed. He often thought about those two young men and wondered what paths they were walking now. One afternoon, as he was tending to the small garden in his backyard, the phone rang. He wiped his hands on a towel and answered. It was the police officer who had visited him before. The officer said, Sir, I thought you might want to know. The two young men had their first court hearing today. They both pleaded guilty and mentioned you in their statements. The old man frowned slightly. Mention me? What for? The officer chuckled softly. They told the judge you were the reason they decided to turn themselves in. Said you made them realize what they'd become. The judge was moved. He's considering a lighter sentence because they showed genuine remorse. For a long moment, the old man didn't speak. He just listened to the quiet hum of the phone line. Finally, he said softly, Maybe that's their new beginning. After the call ended, he sat on his porch thinking about the strange way life worked. A few months ago, he had been alone, living quietly, barely speaking to anyone. Then, in one single night, everything changed. He had faced danger, but instead of anger, it had brought him purpose. It reminded him that his life still mattered, that he could still make a difference. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. The handwriting was shaky, but familiar. It was from one of the young men. The letter began with an apology and ended with gratitude. It said, That night changed me. I've started reading again. I'm taking classes in prison and trying to fix things. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be someone better. Thank you for not giving up on me when I didn't deserve kindness." The old man read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it inside an old wooden box where he kept his most meaningful things: medals, photographs, and small notes from the past. He sat there for a while, staring out the window, feeling something warm inside. It wasn't pride, it was peace. Days turned into weeks and the seasons began to change. The trees outside his house slowly turned golden, and the air grew cooler. One morning, he went for a walk to the park, where he often watched the children play. There was laughter in the air, and he found himself smiling without even realizing it. Life had a funny way of teaching lessons, he thought. Some came through pain, some through peace. At the far end of the park, he noticed a community center being renovated. A banner hung outside. Youth Mentorship Program. Volunteers needed. He stopped for a moment, reading the words again. Then he turned around and walked home, thinking. That evening, he sat at his desk, looking at the flyer he'd picked up from the park. He hadn't volunteered for anything in years. The idea of guiding young people stirred something in him. After all, he had seen firsthand how a little patience and understanding could change a life. The next morning, he called the number on the flyer. A woman answered, cheerful and welcoming. When he explained who he was and what had happened, she said warmly, "We'd love to have someone like you. The kids need real stories, real guidance. You'd be perfect for this." A week later, he found himself standing in front of a small group of teenagers in a room filled with bright posters and worn-out chairs. Some of the kids looked bored, others curious. The coordinator introduced him simply as a man with lessons worth listening to. He didn't prepare a speech, he just spoke from the heart. He told them about mistakes, not just his own, but the ones he had seen others make. He talked about choices and how every moment mattered, even the ones that seemed small. The teenagers listened quietly. Some nodded, some avoided eye contact, but they all heard him. After the session, a few of them came up to him. One of the boys said, "You really believe people can change?" The old man smiled softly. "I've seen it with my own eyes." As weeks went by, he began volunteering regularly. Every Friday he shared stories, not about war or violence, but about courage, honesty, and doing the right thing even when it's hard. The young people respected him, not because of his medals, but because he treated them like human beings, not lost causes. One day, as he was leaving the center, the coordinator handed him a small envelope. "This came for you," she said, "from someone named Daniel." He didn't recognize the name at first, but when he opened the letter, he smiled. It was from the second young man, the one who had come to his house weeks after the break-in. The letter was longer this time. It said he and his friend were both in a rehabilitation program that allowed them to work while serving time. They were helping repair old buildings and teaching other inmates basic skills. The letter ended with, "I don't know where I'd be if that night hadn't happened. You didn't just stop us, you saved us. I hope someday I can thank you face to face." The old man folded the letter carefully and placed it next to the first one. That night he sat in his armchair and looked around the house that had once felt empty. It didn't feel that way anymore. Each letter, each memory, filled it with something new, a sense of connection. Months later, the youth center invited him to speak at a small local event about community safety and second chances. The hall was full of people, parents, teachers, even local officers. He stood on the small stage, his hands steady, his voice calm. He didn't use big words or dramatic pauses. He just spoke truthfully, he said. "People often ask me if I was scared that night. The truth is, I wasn't. I was sad. Sad to see two young men throw away their lives without realizing how much they still had. But fear doesn't fix anything. Anger doesn't teach anyone. Only patience and understanding can do that. Sometimes all a person needs is someone who doesn't give up on them." The room was silent for a moment, and then people began to clap. It wasn't a loud applause, but it was heartfelt. After the event, several people came up to thank him. Some shared their own stories, of family, of loss, of forgiveness. One woman even said, You made me believe in people again." That night, walking home under the soft glow of streetlights, the old man felt lighter. He thought about how far he had come from that night when fear and danger knocked on his door. He realized that what had started as a break-in had turned into something beautiful, a reminder that even the darkest nights can bring light. When he reached home, he poured himself a cup of tea and sat by the window. The street was quiet, just as it had been that night. But this time, he didn't feel the same. He felt grateful for the lessons, the peace, and even the unexpected visitors who had reminded him that kindness is never wasted. As he looked at the stars, he whispered to himself, "We all stumble, but it's what we do afterward that defines us." Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the calm of the night surround him once more. A year had passed since that unforgettable night, and the veteran's life had taken a turn he never expected. His once quiet days were now filled with visits to the youth center, meetings with community groups, and long conversations with people who wanted to hear his story. He had never imagined that something that began with fear and chaos would end up giving his life new purpose. Every morning, he still followed the same simple routine, waking early, making his coffee, feeding the birds outside the window. But there was a new lightness in how he moved, a quiet joy in every small moment. Sometimes he'd stop and think about how much could change in 1 year. His home, which used to feel heavy with silence, now carried laughter and the sound of people visiting. Neighbors dropped by more often. Children from the youth program sometimes came to help him with chores, though he knew it was really just an excuse to listen to more of his stories. On a bright spring morning, he received a letter that made him pause. The return address was from a halfway house 2 towns away. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a short note from one of the 2 young men who had broken into his home that night. The letter said, "I've been released on probation. I'm working at a small workshop fixing furniture. It feels strange being free again, but I'm trying hard to do things right this time. I wanted to thank you again for what you did that night, not just for stopping us, but for seeing something in us worth saving. If you ever want help around your house, I'd be honored to give back in any way I can." The veteran read the letter twice before setting it down. He didn't know what to say or do right away. There was a long moment of stillness. Then he smiled faintly. He decided to write back, keeping his message short and warm. He told the young man he was proud of his progress and that the door to his home and his heart would always remain open to those who tried to change. A few weeks later, a small pickup truck pulled into his driveway. When the veteran stepped out to see who it was, he recognized the young man from that night. His hair was shorter now, and there was a calmness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He walked up slowly, carrying a box of tools. Thought, "I'd fix that broken porch step you mentioned in your letter," the young man said, his voice humble but steady. The veteran smiled. "I was hoping you would." They worked together in silence for a while. The old wood creaked beneath their hands, and the warm sun spilled across the porch. After they finished, the young man sat on the steps, wiping sweat from his brow. "I still think about that night," he said quietly. "Sometimes I wish I could go back and change everything." The veteran sat beside him. "You can't change the past," he said gently. "But you can decide what to do with what you've learned. That's what matters." The young man nodded slowly. "I'm trying. I'm saving money, maybe for trade school. I want to do something that lasts. I never thought I'd be saying that a year ago." The veteran smiled again, his eyes soft. "You're already doing it. You showed up." For a while they just sat there watching the breeze move through the trees. It was a peaceful silence, one that spoke of forgiveness, growth, and new beginnings. Later that day, the veteran invited him in for lunch. They sat at the kitchen table eating sandwiches and laughing about small things. It wasn't awkward. It felt natural, almost as if they'd known each other for years. The young man told stories from his childhood, how things had gone wrong, how he had lost direction. The veteran listened carefully, never judging, just understanding. Before the young man left, he said, "You know, I think I'd like to help with those kids you mentor at the center. Maybe if they hear from someone who's actually been in trouble, it might help. The veteran looked at him proudly. That's a fine idea. Let's talk to the coordinator together. A week later, the two of them walked into the youth center side by side. Some of the kids looked surprised when they saw a young man speaking, honestly about his mistakes, not trying to sound tough or proud, but real. He told them how fear and desperation could make a person forget who they were, and how a single act of kindness could change everything. The room was silent when he finished. The veteran could see in their eyes that the message had landed somewhere deep. Later, one of the teenagers approached him quietly and said, "Maybe people really can change." From that day forward, the young man became a regular volunteer at the center. He worked hard, spoke honestly, and slowly rebuilt his life. The veteran watched him grow and couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. It wasn't pride for what he had done. It was gratitude for the chance life had given them both. Months passed. The other young man, the one who had also turned himself in, was released a bit later. When he heard about his friend's work at the youth center, he asked if he could join too. The veteran welcomed him without hesitation. The three of them became a small but steady team, mentoring, helping, and listening to those who needed it most. Sometimes, when they finished for the day, they would sit outside the center and talk about how strange life was. The young men often said they owed everything to that night, but the veteran would always reply, "You don't owe me anything. You owe it to yourselves. You made the choice to change." Word spread through the community about the unlikely friendship between a retired veteran and two former thieves. It became a quiet example of redemption that inspired others. A local newspaper even wrote an article about them, calling it "The Night That Saved 3 Lives." The veteran laughed when he read the headline, but deep down he knew it was true. One crisp autumn evening, the youth center hosted a small celebration to honor volunteers. The hall was filled with people, teachers, families, and students. When the veteran's name was called, he stood slowly, a little shy of the attention, and walked to the stage. The applause was warm and long. The coordinator handed him a simple plaque that read, "For kindness, courage, and faith in people." He didn't make a long speech. He just said softly, "Sometimes life gives us second chances, not to change what's behind us, but to build what's ahead. Never think one good act doesn't matter, it always does." After the ceremony, as people mingled and laughed, the veteran stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The two young men joined him, standing under the stars. One of them said, "Feels strange, doesn't it? How one mistake can lead to something like this." The veteran nodded slowly. "Strange, yes, but that's life. It breaks us sometimes, but it also gives us the pieces to build something better." They stood there for a while, not needing to say anything more. The air was cool, and the streetlights flickered softly in the distance. For the first time in a long time, all three of them felt completely at peace. When the veteran returned home later that night, he placed the plaque on a small table near the 2 letters he had saved. He looked around the room, at the soft glow of the lamp, the framed photographs, and the small reminders of a long life lived fully. He smiled quietly. He poured himself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and looked out at the moonlit sky. Somewhere out there, 2 young men were walking a better path. Somewhere out there, more people were finding hope because of their story. He thought about the journey, the fear, the forgiveness, the unexpected friendship, and realized it had all been worth it. Sometimes, the most meaningful stories start with a moment of chaos, only to end with peace. As the night grew still, he whispered softly, almost to himself, "Maybe life isn't about what happens to us, but what we choose to make of it." And with that, he leaned back in his chair, the gentle sound of the night filling the room, knowing deep inside that every second of his life, even the hard ones, had led to this quiet, beautiful peace.